All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. June 28th, 1914, one single event completely shatters global peace, eventually brings massive, ancient empires to a bloody end, and plunges multiple continents into absolute chaos. We all know it today as World War I. But how did we actually get there? Was it really just one isolated incident? Well, today we're going to look closely at the underlying causes and really break down the true anatomy of an unprecedented global catastrophe.
Now, what's just absolutely wild about this timeline is how a bounced bomb and literally just a simple wrong turn accidentally placed a prince right in front of his assassin. The Austro-Hungarian prince Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were visiting a newly annexed territory. Earlier that morning, they actually survived an initial bombing attempt. The bomb literally bounced right off their car and injured 20 people in the street. So they changed their plans, deciding instead to visit the injured at the hospital. But their driver makes a crucial mistake. He takes a wrong turn, and while he's trying to reverse back to the correct route, the car just stalls, right there, 5 feet away from a 19-year-old high school student named Gavrilo Princip. Princip draws a gun, fires, and just like that, successfully assassinates the prince.
Which brings us to a really fascinating question. If we could, hop into a time machine, go back to that exact street corner, and somehow stop that 19-year-old from pulling the trigger, would we have prevented World War I? Would those 20 million lives have been saved? Well, because the reality of global warfare is, frankly, never quite that simple, the answer is, unfortunately, no.
See, the crucial point here is that this single assassination was really just a spark. It ignited a geopolitical powder keg that had been quietly building up for decades. Think about a massive mountain of dynamite. If someone walks up to it and strikes a tiny matchstick, causing this enormous explosion, you wouldn't say the explosion happened just because of the matchstick, right? It happened because the dynamite was already piled high, just waiting for a reason to detonate.
So, let's move into our first section, Europe's powder keg. Let's see how this mountain of dynamite was actually built.
Back in 1914, Europe's map was completely dominated by sprawling, insanely powerful empires. You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire right in the middle, sitting next to a massively expanded German empire, plus the vast Russian and Ottoman empires. And out of all these nations, there were only 3 actual European democracies: France, Switzerland, and San Marino. That's it. Everywhere else, unchecked monarchs and emperors were running the show, making massive, life-altering decisions without paying any real attention to what their people actually wanted.
Let's trace how regional tensions really escalated over a span of about 30 years. Back in 1878, after a war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was given the right to temporarily administer Bosnia-Herzegovina. But fast forward to 1908, and they decided to just outright invade and annex it. Obviously, this completely enraged the local Bosnians. They had just spent 400 years under Ottoman rule, and honestly, they just wanted their freedom. It also totally infuriated neighboring Serbia. You see, the people of Eastern Europe share the ethnicity of Slavs, and the South Slavs in these regions dreamed of creating one united nation, a Yugoslavia. And it was this shared ethnic connection that birthed revolutionary student groups like Young Bosnia, which, as it turns out, is the very group our 19-year-old assassin belonged to.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the Mountain of Dynamite. What exactly was all this explosive material made of?
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the conflict, we need to break down 4 fundamental pillars that made a global war practically inevitable: nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and alliances. These are the underlying causes, the actual dynamite that have been quietly stockpiling.
The first cause was weaponized nationalism. Now, this wasn't about a fight for liberation. This was an aggressive nationalism pushed by monarchs to fuel their own ambitions. It basically relied on the belief that your own country was just inherently racially superior to everyone else. Kings and emperors actively weaponized this feeling. They bred this hostile attitude toward neighboring countries purely to convince everyday commoners to happily march off and fight for them.
And this aggressive expansion was deeply tied to imperialism and the economic engine of capitalism. The source material links this directly, citing figures like Henry Ford, pointing out how empires were essentially looting resources for profit. Capitalist nations were annexing other countries just to exploit their raw materials and cheap labor. And, well, they quickly realized that to maintain this massive global looting operation, they were going to need some serious military force to back it up.
Which leads us to militarism. The sheer scale of this was just staggering. To put it in perspective, the combined military spending of the 6 great powers literally quadrupled from £94 million in 1870 right up to 1914.
Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Italy, they were all pouring astronomical amounts of money into their militaries. They were fueling a massive, unprecedented arms race, both to protect the territories they grabbed and, of course, to threaten their rivals.
And the fourth pillar? A super complex web of alliances. These were originally formed out of intense imperial paranoia. Because these empires were constantly trying to capture new territories, they were terrified of each other. If one country grabbed a new region, its rivals immediately felt threatened. So what did they do? They formed mutual protection pacts. You had the Triple Alliance bonding Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy. And on the other side, Great Britain, France, and Russia formed the Triple Entente. It basically guaranteed that if one power went to war, well, they all did.
Tragically, while this became an absolute global disaster for the masses, at the very top level, it was essentially a violent, real-life family feud. I mean, it's a staggering historical fact. The hot-tempered Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain, they were literally all first cousins. Queen Victoria had tried to keep them from fighting while she was alive. But after her death, there was absolutely nothing stopping these royal relatives from plunging their empires and millions of their completely disenfranchised subjects into a bloodbath just to settle their imperial jealousies.
Let's jump into Section 3, the domino effect. Let's see how all of this builds into an unstoppable chain reaction. In a matter of days after the prince was assassinated, the alliance system kicked in exactly as designed, and it pulled all of Europe's major powers into the conflict like falling dominoes. First, an enraged Austro-Hungarian emperor declares war on Serbia. Then, Russia, seeing this as an attack on their Slavic brothers, steps in to save Serbia. Next up, Germany sees Russia mobilizing and immediately jumps in to protect its ally, Austro-Hungary. And finally, France honors the Triple Entente and quickly takes up arms alongside Russia. In what was incredibly ironically called the Chain of Friendship, Europe was officially at war. And very quickly, this conflict swallows the entire globe. The Ottoman Empire, which already had a really bitter rivalry with Russia, joins the Austro-Hungarian side. The UK gets pulled in via their alliance. And because empires like Britain span the whole world, they tapped right into their colonial populations for manpower. Thousands of young men in places like India, who were completely disconnected from these European royal squabbles, were suddenly thrust right onto the battlefield. Imperialism literally dragged the rest of the world into Europe's mess.
Which brings us to our final section, propaganda and reality. Let's explore the massive gap between what the public was told and what they actually experienced.
It is a super vital question to ask. I mean, these commoners had absolutely zero say in the democratic process of these empires. Sure, the rulers wanted to expand their borders and grab resources, but why on earth would a poor, unemployed civilian voluntarily enlist to go die for that? Well, the answer lies in how governments aggressively manipulated their own people.
State propaganda and linguistic nationalism were just incredibly powerful tools. The media and state-appointed poets deliberately glorified the war. They spun these horrific military blunders into epic tales of selfless sacrifice, like Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. But on the ground, the reality was a totally different story. Poets who actually saw the trenches, guys like Wilfred Owen, they exposed the bitter, gritty nightmare. They wrote about agonizing, poisonous fumes, coughing up blood, and shattered limbs. It wasn't heroic at all. It was just incredibly inhumane.
Thomas Hardy's legendary anti-war poem perfectly captures this tragedy. It highlights the insane irony of two men who in any other life could have just been friends, forced to kill each other for their rulers. These everyday folks were driven by a desperate need for employment, not some grand desire to conquer. They put on a uniform just to feed their families, only to be sent to a muddy, freezing trench to look another equally poor, desperate commoner right in the eye and shoot them dead.
But there was this one absolutely incredible moment of humanity where common soldiers actually rejected the propaganda. During Christmas of 1914, British and German soldiers literally laid down their weapons, walked out into no man's land, shared food, and even sang together. They realized they had no personal reason to hate each other. Of course, the royal commanders absolutely freaked out. They aggressively ordered the troops back to war, threatening them with execution by their own firing squads if they deserted. But as the years dragged on, the pushback only grew. Entire French battalions eventually dropped their arms, and Russian soldiers even turned their weapons around to wage war against their own oppressive rulers.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought about the true nature of the powers that plunged our world into its first great war. Gavrilo Princip's bullets, yes, they were the spark. But the unchecked ambitions, the aggressive nationalism, and the greedy imperial rivalries of a few powerful cousins, they built the bomb. And tragically, the common people paid the ultimate price. Knowing how easily a massive mountain of dynamite can be hidden behind state propaganda, what must we be looking out for today to make absolutely sure we never let someone strike that match again? Keep questioning, keep learning, and thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.